Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session webinar titled Skill Up, Data Journalism and Visualization. I am Paola Condemayta, Project Coordinator at Journalismfund.eu, and I'm managing for the moment the Professional Development Grants for Environmental Journalism and the Modern Slavery Unveiled Grant Program. And my colleague Claudia Brunkaerts is coordinating the investigation grants for environmental journalism. At Journalismfund.eu, we are dedicated to advancing independent and investigative journalism across Europe that serves the public interest, furthers accountability as well as transparency, and contributes to critical thinking and well-informed debate. This webinar has been organized by Journalism Fund, and this webinar is part of our Earth Investigations program, launched in 2021. 2 grant programs for environmental journalism, one for cross-border teams of journalists and news outlets to investigate environmental affairs, and another program for organizations to develop training and support services targeting environmental journalists. As part of the Earth Investigations program, Journalism Fund is launching a series of trainings and webinars that will be accessible to the environmental journalism community. And if you want to receive the notifications about our next events, please subscribe to our newsletter. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded to be available for viewing afterwards. If you have any questions for the presenters, please use the chat feature in this Zoom webinar. Each presenter today will have a total of 25 minutes for their presentations. If one of our presenters completes their presentation before their 25 minutes, there may be time for a question from attendees. However, we will hold most questions until the end of the session, and I will then read questions out loud for the presenters to answer as time permits. Today, we'll be discussing how to think using different data tools and diving deeper into the visualization aspect. Public access to digital material has grown significantly during the past several years. As data volumes increase, so does the need for trustworthy information. And in light of this, Journalism Fund is launching a series of webinars to support journalists as they begin their journeys into data journalism, a discipline that has demonstrated benefits for newsrooms, such as expanding audience reach, boosting views and engagement, strengthening quality journalism, and enhancing brand recognition. We will be featuring today Helena, Bengtsson, and Amanda Cox. We would also like to inform you that at the end, we will send you the link to a survey via the chat. Of course, this is not mandatory, but it will be very useful for us to organize more webinars in the framework of environmental journalism. Having said this, we would also like to know from where you are following this webinar. So right now, we are sharing a question on your screen, and you can tell us from which region of the world you are connecting to. So I will launch right now our poll. So please let us know. You can just select the region where you are living now and from where you are following this session. Thank you to all those people who registered and who are now following this webinar on Zoom, but thank you also to those ones who are connected on Facebook, where also the webinar is available. Please don't hesitate to share this webinar at the link on Facebook with the person that you think is going to be interested, because I'm totally sure that today we will have very useful tips from Helena and Amanda regarding data journalism. So, okay, I got, I think, all the answers. Oh, everyone participated, and I can end the poll. Okay, so we have one person from Asia, we have also 3 journalists from Africa, we have people from Southern Europe, and many of our attendees today are from Western Europe. Thank you for being here. We have also some attendees from Eastern Europe, and those are the regions that are today present in this webinar. Thank you. Thank you for connecting today. So we will start with Helena Bengtsson, who will be speaking about getting a data state of mind. She is data journalism editor at Gota Media, a regional publishing company in the south of Sweden with 13 local titles. She previously worked as editor for data journalism at Sveriges Television, Sweden's national television broadcaster, for 27 years, and she also served as editor of data projects at The Guardian between 2014 and 2017. In 2006 and 2007, she was database editor at the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, D.C. She was awarded the Stora Journalist Present, the Swedish Grand Prize for Journalism, in Sweden twice, and in 2010 for Valpel.se, and in 2016 for Innovator of the Year. So, Helena, now the floor is yours. Thank you for being here. And well, we are ready to hear you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm sad I can't see you all, but I hope that you can hear me fine. I'm going to talk today a little bit about data journalism as a whole, as sort of how to think more like a data journalist, or how to use data as part of your journalism, maybe I should say, because I really think that data journalism is just a method for journalists, and it doesn't really matter what issue you're covering, you should be able to use these methods. So I'm going to share my presentation and hope that this works. And we're doing this. So this is about, I think, getting a data state of mind. And I would say that for me, data journalism is not so much about numbers. Actually, I think that it's a misconception that we so easily think that numbers and data journalism go together. For me, it's much more about giving your stories context and structure. So as a very small example, I am, as Paola said, the data editor for 13 local papers in the south of Sweden. And I have my desk at one of those papers, and at the morning meeting, they were doing a very sort of fluffy story that you do in a local paper, which was that one of the elementary schools was getting a new playground. So they were doing a story about that. But the conversation came around to, was this a very small school, and was it maybe the smallest school in the region, or even the smallest school in the country? Well, I said, let me check that. And you just pull up you go to the education agency in Sweden, you pull up the statistics and you sort the data. This is sort of one of the great ways to find a story, is just to sort. So we could just sort all schools, and then I could filter for the schools in our region. And I found out that it wasn't even the smallest school in our region. There was a school that had only 22 students, and this school that we were looking at had 27 students. But it made for a nice headline, and that was basically the only thing we used the data for. It says, great new playground for one of the region's smallest schools. And we could also do a list and say that this is the smallest schools in the region. So by doing that, we sort of got an extra article out of just doing that little search. I'm going to show you a very old concept. This is something we don't say so much anymore. We don't talk about computer-assisted reporting. We did when I started out with this. And for me, CAR, or data journalism, is divided into sort of two groups. It's the analysis bit, which is sort of where we sort, as we did, where we filter, which means that we select parts of the data, we do some calculations maybe, we group things together, or we cross-match data, and we gather a lot of data. And then you have the presentation, which is just as important. That's the other leg of the data journalism, so to say, where we have tables and charts and graphs and all that. And in the best of worlds, of course, we work together, we do an analysis, we write a story, we do a presentation. So sort of everything goes together. To keep you in sort of historic times almost, this is an old story. In 2010, I was called by one of my bosses, and the boss said, would you like to go to London to look at a database? And you can't tell anyone that you're going. And I said, okay, I can go to London and look at a database if that's what you want me to do. So I went to London, and it turned out that that was the WikiLeaks Iraq database. And the first thing I did when I got that database, and at that time, it was considered a very large database. Nowadays, we know it wasn't anymore, but for that, there was over almost 400,000 rows in that data. And the first thing I did was to ask the data this question: is there any documents that has the letters SVED in them, which means that is there something that says Sweden or Swedish? And that means that from those almost 400,000 rows, I got 57 rows that had something about Sweden. So I found the details that could be interesting to write a story about. And we did a lot of stories. We did stories about the Swedish weapons that were used in the American war, and also sometimes that didn't function so well. But my favorite story is this story. So this is one of the documents or one of the posts in the data. And this is about an Iranian man who has an Iraqi passport and a Swedish driver's license, actually. And he was detained outside Baghdad and thrown into jail for several days. And we could sort of, because the name of him was on this document, we could find the name and we could look him up. He was back in Sweden. He was working at a car shop there, and we could sort of talk about and give the story behind the sort of dry data point. And I think that is always what I look for. I always look for the story, not necessarily the number, but the story. So another of those stories is also has to do with finding sort of the story in this is a larger data set. This is one of the business reporters at Swedish television came to me, and she said, I hear that the Swedish government is, for some strange reason, raising the bar when it comes to environmentally friendly cars. So in Sweden, there is a rule that if you have a car that has, and it used to be 60 grams or 60 milligrams, 60 something carbon dioxide in their exhaust, you got a bonus when you bought that car. So you get that car much cheaper than if you buy a car that is less sort of environmentally friendly. Well, she heard that the government was thinking of raising that bar to 70 grams or milligrams. I should have really known that, but it was a while since I did that story. So they were raising it from 60 to 70. So how could we do this story? Well, we started out by talking about just car models, but it turned out that, especially when you have such a narrow field between 60 and 70, you actually have to look at the individual cars. So we asked the Department of Vehicles in Sweden to give us all the cars that had gotten the bonus and were between, or all the cars that were sold that had gotten this measurement, I should say. And I did a filter again, which means that I selected out only the cars that were between 60 and 70, which means these were the cars that had benefited from that raise. So we did then what is called a pivot table, which means that we grouped the different kinds of cars together, and we count all the cars that were for each type of car. So you can see that there was a couple of Audis, there were a couple of BMWs and Mercedes and so on, but the bulk of it all, the bulk of the company, the cars that benefited from this raise were the Swedish, or former Swedish, I should say, car company Volvo, which means that we could do the story that says that it was only Volvo that was benefited by this governmental change in their rules, which was sort of became a big story. And actually the government decided to lower that bar again. And Volvo wasn't, as I'm told, at all happy about that. So this is also sort of a small story. We recently had an election in Sweden, and before that election, I worked with one of my smallest papers. We have a paper in the town of Trelleborg, and they are very small. They only go to print three days a week. They have a website, of course, but they only go to print 3 days a week. So before the election, they wanted to look at all the political candidates for their local council. So we looked at them, and we looked at them by party, and we just calculated the percentage of women for each party and found out that the candidates were actually only 38% female, which is in Sweden a big no-no. We are supposed to be equal. The number should be closer to 50-50. So just being very close to not even 40% was, a big story with them. Well, that's also great, because once the election was over and the local parliament was in place, they could then do the story where it actually showed that when they came into parliament, there were only 29% women, which was an improvement from the previous election, where there was only 25% women, but still very, very low. And it was the lowest one in the big region that Trelleborg is a part of. So I'm going to go to a little bit larger story now. And this is the only story I've found that has sort of an environmental, besides I guess the environmental cars also are environmental. Anyway, this is an old story, as you can see. It's done by it was done in Google Maps. But what we did there was that every region in Sweden gathers information about contaminated places. And this is usually old industrial sites like sawmills or glass factories or chemical plants, for instance, and that sort of thing. And every single region gather information about these plants. So for every region, we got a database of all these places. And there's also old sort of where people throw away things and so on. So we could then build a website for people where they could search for their area, for instance, or sort by name and that sort of thing. And every object we built together with developers as their own page with information from the database, but also a possibility to tell us about something more about that page. So it has a box here that says, do you know anything else about this? Please email us. And it gives a possibility to email us. But that is just that's just one part of it. The part of it is that's the list we have of contaminated places. So what is the story? Well, the story could be, for instance, that some of these places are close to something else. So these are the areas of drinking water or protected water in one of the regions. This is the region where I'm from, and this is the region where I'm actually sitting right now. And we then cross-matched, which is another sort of tool. We cross-matched the drinking water with the contaminated places. And we then found out a number of places that were very close to or next to drinking water, resources of drinking water. And one of them was this place called Löfstabruk, which was our first case study when we did our story. And I think it's quite important that once we found these places, so we went from sort of 5,000 places down to, I think it was 181 that we found that were close to places. And for most of these places, you still have to the story is not done when we've done the merge. I think that's also really important to say, is that was our starting point. Instead of looking at 5,000 places, we could now look at 181 places, I think it was. And then we did ordinary journalism. We went and asked for documents about this place. We went and talked to experts. We talked to people living there, and so on and so on. So, I mean, the journalism helped us find the locations to where we should go on doing our reporting. And we could do this story, which was basically says high doses of arsenic next to the children's swimming place, or the lake where the children were swimming, sort of. The people swimming don't know anything, sort of. So that was this first story we did. But the good thing about collecting your own data and having your own data in this way is that there's not one story in this. So we sent out pieces of the story to every single local affiliate that we had around in Sweden, and they could do their own story about this. They could do anything from shooting ranges to glass factories, to sometimes they just did lists, the 10 most poisonous places next to you, sort of, and they did that as a local affiliate. So this is when data exists. Sometimes you will have a hard time finding data. So what do we do then? Well, we've all been through the same, and I think it is very interesting that we've all sort of been through the same ordeal the last years, where the pandemic, and in the very early start in the pandemic, we got reports that there were a lot of elderly people dying in the care homes. And this story actually started with one care home in Stockholm, where I'm getting very close to end. I see that. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about this story. We got the story that there were a lot of people dying in the care homes, but the agencies and the government was very reluctant to share any numbers when especially during the pandemic, they were almost like in a panic. We then, because in Sweden, we can know where everybody lives. It's a public record where people lives. We could then, this is me showing you that you can find out where I live. And what we then did was that we found addresses for all the care homes in Sweden. And we basically asked a company who has this data to give us all the people that had died on those addresses, that were living on those addresses. And by doing that, we can see, and by doing that, looking at, for instance, how many people had died, we compared it to previous years. So you can see here, for instance, that we would have data where there were 8, 14, and 8 people dying in the last years. And then in 2020, in the same time period, we had 31. So we're pretty sure that something extraordinary had happened at that time. So by doing that, we could actually determine that there was 30% more people dying than it had been in previous years. And the governmental agency, who up until we launched our story had tried to say, we are protecting the elderly, they are not dying into any more extent that they should have been, they actually had to back down, and they had to do a data run on their own. They had access to better numbers than we, so they actually came up with a 40% higher death rate than previous years. I think I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to stop, because I'm almost at my time, right, Paola?
You still have time.
You still have time. Yes. Am I 25 or 35?
25, but no,
25.
You still have time. You still have time.
I still have time. I think that one thing that's really important that I want to stress is that when you do something that is very complicated, like this was a fairly complicated analysis, we knew that we weren't catching all the people living in those care homes for certain reasons. We actually write quite a long and detailed, this is how we did it. So we will write about how did we do it, what are the caveats, what are the things that we considered, and so on and so on. So that people who wonders, how did you do the story? How come you came up to this result? We actually do sort of, and for one so those are a very long story that sort of describes how we did a story. So, and I think I'm gonna stop there, and for people who want to know how we worked with collecting our own data, they are willing to see my slides.
Thank you, Helena. We have for the moment one question, and it's from a person who comes from an academic background, and the person is asking, what kind of data validity checks do you tend to go through when publishing these articles? I imagine, because I think we don't, well, journalists don't do papers, but this kind of information, articles, reports, what kind of validity checks do you tend to go through, Helena?
We try to do as much as we can, and this could be published as an article or as a data visualization or as a TV news in this case. So we try to do as much as possible. We are not scientists, but we sometimes take the help of scientists if we have complicated. I did another story where we actually took in 2 scientists from 2 different universities to look at our calculations and our conclusions for a data set. We try to make, so whatever we can to make sure that the data is correct by doing sums and looking at the data for different ways. So we try to do as best as we can, and most of all, we try to describe what we have done. So that's what's the last thing I talked about, was exactly that even though we are not, scientists, we try to explain in as much detail as possible what we have done so that the public can see and criticize if they want, but to see what we have done.
Okay, thank you, Helena. Thank you, Wouter, also for your question. So now we will continue. We don't have any questions anymore, but I'm sure that people are preparing their questions for the end. So thank you, Helena. We will move on to our next speaker, who is Amanda Cox, who will be speaking about data visualization. As you could have seen, we try to split this webinar into parts, how to get into the basics of data journalism, how you can start. And now we will go to the next part of data journalism, that is the visualization. And Amanda Cox will be speaking about data visualization. She's an American journalist and head of spatial data projects at USA Facts. Until January 2022, she was the graphics editor of the New York Times. Data journalism. She helps develop and teach data journalism courses at the New York University School of Journalism. Prior to the New York Times, Amanda worked at the Federal Reserve Board from 2001 to 2003. She was awarded the National Design Award in 2009 and the Excellence in Statistical Reporting Award from the American Statistical Association in 2012. Amanda received a bachelor's degree in math and economics from State Olaf in 2001 and a master's degree in statistics from the University of Washington in 2005. So Amanda, now the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Should have given you the short bio, I'm pretty sure. So the important thing out of that, a couple of things, I spent a long time of my career working at the New York Times, and I understand that many of you are environmental journalists. And so I picked some environmental examples today. And because it's the work I'm familiar with, a lot of them are from the Times, but it's not my own work. It's the work of my colleagues who worked in the science desk or the climate desk or the graphics desk or others. So I bring it to you today just only as a fan is what one thing I would say. The other thing I would say, just to get started, is as Helena showed us, like the results of your data journalism can take a lot of forms, right? Like it could just be an idea that you go write a story off of. It could end up just being the headline of your story, right? That's what the data could look like in practice. It could be the name of someone to call or an address to go to. But the world I came from, like the result of that could also be a visualization of some sort, a chart, a map, a diagram, some type of thing. And there are three things that I think visualizations are very good at conveying that I wanted to talk to you about today, about why would you choose to actually visualize your data? What are the types of ideas that visualization is good for? And those are, if you're trying to show scale of some type, context of some type, or patterns of some type, I think visualization is something in your toolbox that you might reach for. And so let's just take those one at a time. The first one is scale. And an example I like to talk about when I talk about scale is this NASA map. It's not our map, it's a NASA map, and it's a map of the walk on the moon. And it looks like kind of like a typical scientific map, and not maybe even typical. I think it's good. You know, you've got a scale in meters or feet. So if you're in America or Europe, you're good to go. There's lots of little different types of rocks in the legend, and different types of like where the TV cameras are and the path of the walk. It's a fine map. It's a good map. It's a scientific map. It conveys some information. You can think about of scale. You know, you've got a couple of scales here in the diagram. There's a NASA version of this map that I like more. That is that walk on the moon showed on a baseball diagram. And if you are familiar with a baseball field, you immediately get a sense of like, oh, I get how big this walk was right away. I don't even have to think about it. I showed this example to some students in Norway a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, oh yeah, you don't know what a baseball field is, so that's not helpful to you. So we could put it on a soccer field or a football field too. And right away, I think you get a sense of the scale. You know how big this walk was without even having to think about it. And I think that is some of the power of visualization, that I just get it intuitively. I can just feel it. I don't have to like stop and process meters in my head or translate. I just get an idea right away. But it works even, you know, this route, the route that Neil Armstrong took when he was walking on the moon, it's kind of complicated. There's a lot of detail in there. You saw some different things. But this idea about scale and how visualization can be powerful works even when it's much simpler, even I think when you're just even talking about like two numbers. So here's an example some of my other colleagues did at one point about like, here's what $250 worth of allergy medicine looks like in the United States, and here's what it looks like in Romania. You get more in Romania. It's just two numbers. It's not hard, but you could say like, oh, but like United States is a richer country than Romania. That's maybe unfair. And so we could say, okay, fine. We don't have to do it that way. We could say, here's what this kind of pill looks like in the United States. You could get 19, and in Belgium, you could get 445 of these things. I forget. I just looked up what that treats, and I've just forgotten it. But you know, or this is like gout medication in the United States, you could get 51, and Saudi Arabia, you can get 9,000, right? These are not complicated ideas at all. Those are just numbers. They're just two numbers. But I feel like you feel it in a different way when you actually see it than if I just wrote those two numbers in a sentence. I get that sense of scale a little bit better. I saw this art project recently, and I know you're interested in different places on different systems. So you that's not what I want. Don't want the ad. Saw this art project recently when I was thinking about these ideas about scale, and it shows like what's extracted from the mine of various types, and you know what the scale of the mining effort was to get that out. So you can see like, okay, so this mine, I got this much gold out of it, and it's helpful because like I don't think about these units, but the diamonds one I think is a really fun one, sense of scale about like this is what we do to the land to get this many carats of diamonds, right? Like this kind of idea about scale, and that's very textured scale, but you get a sense of something, you get a sense of units that you're not super familiar with. So that's scale. The second one, the reason I think you might want to reach toward visualization is about context, which is not always totally different than scale, but when I think of context, I think of really time series charts as kind of my go-to like mental metaphor. And so one of my new colleagues, I work at this little nonprofit called USA Facts now, made this chart just a couple of weeks ago about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And that's a thing that where the units are like thousands of barrels of oil. I think as environmental units, often have like units that are kind of complicated and feel a little unfamiliar, right? So it's like quadrillion tons of BTUs of something. And it's just like, it's units that I don't know and I don't feel and I don't have a sense of what they are. And so President Biden released some oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. He released 180 million barrels of oil into the supply chain. And it's like, is that a lot? Is that a little? Like, I don't know. But if I can show it, I can show you like, here's how much there is over time. And in particular, if I can annotate some key things, right? So here's a hurricane that Americans would know, the Hurricane Katrina, and here's a decrease in oil production from Libya. That's Operation Desert Storm back in the 90s. So especially if I can annotate this chart with some key events, I think annotation is often really important. You can kind of see like, oh, is this like recent decrease? Is that a lot or a little? Like I get a sense of that through the time series, through like through the context of what it been like in the past. And I get that, you know, like very efficiently. I can see the pattern in this. I can see the rise through the 80s and then the stability and then this recent fall. And this is the sort of chart that like all of us could make. All of us could make this chart this afternoon and publish it on our own website. So I like the simple examples too, but context can also be like harder examples. I think of this one. This is a different art project about the size of the Aral Sea and you watch it shrink. And I like it in part because like this kind of 3D paper diagram works only it doesn't work for all data. I have a like special fondness in my heart for like data visualization that only works for some types of data. So if the sea was not shrinking, this paper diagram wouldn't be fun. Like it wouldn't work. You couldn't tell what it was. No matter what, you could like, you know, you could look at satellite images, but I like the idea of taking advantage of something that's unique about your data. So this is the type of context that I think can be really helpful. Another thing that, you know, the power of data visualization sometimes is you can do it personal. So you can do more personal context about like what are your readers or where does it like where they live or where they think. This is an example of some of my colleagues did about like how does the world's air pollution compare with your city? And so, you know, it takes you through some things and you see, you know, different types of maps and more and less and whatever. But I talked about this example once when I was in Boston. And so it had found me in Boston to tell me, you know, here's a chart of the air quality in your city and compares it to San Francisco, because at the time of the story, there were wildfires in San Francisco and air quality in San Francisco was a big story. And the cute part was like, Boston has like, I guess a July 4th tradition of fireworks and setting off like fireworks. And so the July 4th air quality was especially bad in Boston at the time that I was giving this talk. But the interesting thing is like, okay, so now I show you Boston and now I show you, you know, here's the wildfires that we have, you know, been like, or people in San Francisco, where they were wearing masks and like talking about like how bad things were. And it was, you know, thought it was unlivable, but like, okay, now let me show you Boston to New Delhi. And that kind of context about like, let me just get you the scale of these things is so much more effective than talking about these things in terms of 400 micrograms per cubic meter, right? Like just give me it compared to something. The 400 micrograms per cubic meter means like basically nothing to me. It might as well be, you know, you could call it whatever unit. But now when I look at these together and I look at these in the context of like, oh, I know this was really bad in San Francisco, I start to get a sense of what these numbers mean and how they fluctuate over time. So scale is one type of thing that I think data visualization is especially good for. Patterns or context, you know, especially I think of it as time series, how things have changed over time. And then patterns is the third thing that I think is your kind of why would I show a chart? Why would I go to a map or a diagram? And I'll talk about like what I mean by that. So this is just kind of a little table. It's a local election. I don't expect you to be super familiar with this election. It's a mayor in New York City, but it's kind of a classic table, and I think it's a good table. There's there's some smart design choices here about trying to get you to some sense of pattern. So I shade the cells in the table so that like you don't have to actually read the table to get the sense of like here's the pattern or here's like, you know, how much I see. And there's also like this nice annotation layered running down the right-hand side. I always think that when you're making things, especially in a general media context, you're going to spend more time with it than your reader. So you might as well just tell them what the interesting things are, like just do the work for people, help them out a little bit. So I think this is a good table, but I also think it's a little bit like, it's like phone book design kind of, right? Like you're going to design this table no matter what the data shows, and you're just designing things to make it easy for people to look something up, which is fine and good. And you want to do that sometimes. I think the power of data visualization often is more about like trying to show an actual pattern. And so I should have started. This is exit poll data. So it's just, there's an election. You ask people like, who did you vote for? And like, tell me some characteristics about yourself. What is your gender? What is your race and ethnicity, or so on. Here's a totally different sort of exit poll graphic that is like throws away a bunch of the data, could be shown in tabular form instead, but instead we say like, okay, I don't really care about precision so much of these numbers. I care about the patterns that they reveal. And so here, each box is a state. This is a super old graphic. This is when Obama was running against Clinton to decide who would be the nominee for the Democrats to run for president that year. And so we say, okay, every box is a state, part of America. And then, so here are the women boxes and here are the men boxes. Here are the people for Black voters. They're stronger for Obama. White voters were stronger for Clinton. Young voters were more for Obama. A little older, more Clinton. A little older, more Clinton. A little older, more Clinton. By education is my favorite one. So there's no college, some college, college grads, and postgrads. And so that little box in Arkansas, that's the state that the Clintons were from. And so it's a state with a reputation for like not having like a ton of education, or the most educated people. And so the joke is like, oh, those are friends of the Clintons. Like, I know why that box is weird. But I like that box because that box in part is like the whole point to me in part of data visualization is to have patterns jump out that you might not know how to ask about. So that box is interesting, and you probably don't have enough context about America to know like, why is it interesting, or why is that a fun box? But you can tell that it's different, right? And even if you know nothing, even if you come in without a lot of context. I'll give you a different example with that. We're about to have midterm elections in the United States. And so the classic presentation is like a map, and it's a map like this. And it's like not a super helpful map because the way House districts work is they all have about the same number of people. They all have about 700,000 people. And so you have some that are huge, like in Montana, it's been split into two now, but in this year of the map, like had so many pixels. And then like New York City, you can hardly even find it. Like it doesn't even show up, and the geography and these lines change. And so like this map, I would claim to you, like, it's fine, it shows the data, but it doesn't really give the data any chance to be interesting. If there's some interesting pattern in this map, you would have to know a lot to figure it out. There's a different presentation of this data where I can help you try to figure out what's interesting about it, even if you're from Western Europe today and this map is totally unfamiliar to you. So instead of saying like, here we say, let's throw away the geography, like geography is not so important. Instead, I'm going to arrange these seats, these districts, by the ones that like one party was expected to win super easily, and the ones that were like toss-ups, people didn't have an expectation, and then the ones that were the Republicans were expected to win super easily. So even if you know nothing about that map, and I asked you like, tell me an interesting place, tell me a place where you might want to write a story about, tell me like something that like is surprising tonight. Like, so even if you know nothing, I think this presentation of the data gives you a fighting chance, right? If I were you, I'd say like, oh, California 21, that looks like a blue square in that sea of red squares. So if I get kind of like the ordering of this, like that square doesn't belong in that column, right? Like that column looks like really pretty red. Oh, there's another one, right? Like Oklahoma 5. Maybe I'm interested in what happened in Oklahoma 5. It's actually an environmental connection to that one, I think. And so I think the idea of patterns and data visualization is, have I given my data a chance to be interesting? And that often can involve like throwing something out. Yeah, maybe I'll end on this one then instead. This is the classic pattern of election results in the Times, or in the United States, not in the Times. And same kind of idea before: blue for one party and red for the other party. Like darker colors mean stronger strength here, but you can see this pattern a lot. One time we made this pattern, and someone's like, oh, I kind of recognize that from my own research. That looks like a map of cotton farms in the 1860s. Someone else came and put them together and said like, oh, you're right, they're like kind of the same pattern there, that crescent shaped thing. Someone else comes along and says, oh yeah, but you know why that is, right? That's because millions of years ago the sea covered that part of the land, and when the sea receded, the creatures that die in it, they make the soil fertile. That's associated with cotton farming. Cotton farming is associated with slavery. Slavery changes the demographics of an area, and that changes the election results, 100 millions of years later. And so those kind of questions, the why questions, I think are really often better. The like, why did something happen and how did something happen are the kinds of questions that are better questions. Often our tools for data journalism are focused more on the like what and when and where questions. But if you ask them in the right way and string them together in the right way, you can answer all kinds of questions. So I'll stop there in case any of you have questions. I think maybe, and if you don't, I have a couple more examples that I can share with you too.
There are some questions, but perhaps you still have some time left, Amanda. You can continue.
Are you sure?
Yes, you still have some time left.
Okay, so I'll show you, I'll do instead one different example of patterns and one different example of throwing away data, because that can be hard, but I think it's often a case to success. And so this is an example where we're working with an academic who had some data about how much money do people make in the United States when they're a child, when they're parents, what's the kind of family that they're raised in, and then how much money do they make as an adult when they're on their own, when they're around 30 to 40 years old, right? And so it's like, if I grow up poor, do I stay poor? If I grow up rich, do I stay rich? It's about income mobility, really. And they had this very fine-grained tax data. So, records for everyone in the United States. It was almost like Swedish-like in its glory. It was very good and detailed, right? But so like the temptation is like, oh, let's show it all. Like, for the first time, we could show things about every single percentile. We don't have to talk about like the median income. We'll just show you the top 1%, and we'll show you the bottom 1%, and we'll show every percent in between. And that's what this chart is. This chart says like, how likely is it if I'm born rich, do I stay rich on each percentile? But it's hard, right? Like there's no labels on this. It's not finished, but it's still hard. But I thought about this chart a lot about like, oh, we have this new picture about how income is sticky. But this chart form was just too hard. And so like maybe I'm encoding it by color. Maybe if I encode it by height instead, like maybe that reduction was the wrong one. Still hard. Maybe I should try throwing away some data. Maybe I should only show you like a select percentiles about like, here are kids born in the top percentile, like where do they show up? Well, it's more likely that they stay in the top percentile, but like it's still hard. It's still a hard chart. Maybe I could show it some different way. Maybe I don't need to show every percentile. Maybe I could reduce it, right? Just trying on things. And we talk about this and we're like, what are we actually trying to show with this, right? Like we're actually trying to show like kids climbing ladders. And so we talked about like, oh, should we like get a gym and get some kids to climb ladders? But like, that was going to involve like lawyers and felt hard and like, right? Like that just felt hard. But we can do that with our data visualization. We can do like more abstract things too. And so here's one where, we say like, let's follow a bunch of kids who grew up rich. They all grow up actually, let me reload this because that's loading a little. They all grow up rich. They all grow up in the top 20th percentile. The yellow dots are white boys, and the blue dots here are black boys. They're all raised in rich families. Let's follow them throughout their adulthood and see how they end up. And you can kind of get a sense from this that the blue dots are more likely to fall, whereas the yellow dots are a little bit more protected. They're a little bit more likely to stay in the top couple of buckets if they start in the top bucket. The reason I like this data data visualization in part is I think it takes advantage of something that's unique about the data. What's unique about the data is that it's following people over time. And so that visual metaphor is consistent. It's like, what am I showing about you, the data? It's following people over time. I also like it in part because I think it shows a little bit of discipline on our part about like, oh, inside this data, I could show you all different kids. I could show you how the poor kids end up. I could show you how the middle class kids end up. I could show you how the rich kids end up. But here is say like, okay, I don't need to do all of it at once. I can just show you one story about boys in particular, boys who grew up in rich families, and let me show you what happens to them. And if you are Black and you grew up in a rich family, it's like rolling a dice. It's like even out of the buckets, there's like 20% in every bucket. If you're white and you grew up in a rich family, 2/3 of you stay at least in the top two buckets. And so like the first examples that we started with, in some ways, this visualization isn't a ton of numbers, right? Like really, you can think of it, there's only 10 numbers here, and yet, or 11 plus like the number of boys that we follow, but and yet like seeing it helps you feel it in a different way than just showing the 10 numbers. And so I think that the power of seeing is what you're doing with data visualization, whether you're seeing scale, whether you're seeing context of some kind, or whether you're seeing a more complicated pattern like we just saw here. So that was the example I was going to end on, but I'm still happy to take questions if there are more.
Thank you, Amanda, for your intervention and for sharing your experiences with us and the very graphic examples. So now we will have the questions from our attendees. Let me. Okay, so we will move to the questions. We have a question from two attendees that actually is very similar, and it's a question that even me, I was wondering. It's for Amanda. Sarah and Marion they are asking if you could recommend any online free tool to make such cool graphics, visuals, or data specific for journalists.
Yeah, I think as you're getting started, I think Data Wrapper is a fantastic tool, and there are pricing plans, but there's also free plans, so they're pretty generous as you're getting started. I think a really great tool for making maps and charts type of things, and a lot of good examples too. They have a fantastic newsletter where they compile different examples from people around the world that if you're looking for inspiration is like I forget if it comes out, bi-weekly or some type of frequency, but a very strong roundup, often a thematic roundup about like, here are a bunch of people's approaches to something that happened in the news this week. So Data Wrapper is definitely an intro tool that I would recommend free as people are getting started and figuring things out.
Okay, thank you. And then, yeah, that was one of the questions. Then I think it's similar, but from Alina, she says, what software do you use to create such visualizations as about rich adults? I think it's the last one that you show. Is it the same one, or do you have other specific software?
Yeah, so that one, I think the higher end stuff, often you're doing something custom in JavaScript flavor of some sort. And so, I think people now, some people have switched to more of a svelte type framework. D3 is still somewhat popular. Observable is some kind of thing that is a platform that people use and like share some visualizations on. And so I think it's like some type of JavaScript framework is probably the framework that you're going to if you're looking to do custom type of stuff that you want to put on the internet yourself, some flavor of that.
Thank you, Amanda. Now we have another question that I think it could be addressed by Helena. It says, what do you use for the analysis? R or another programming language, Helena?
I'm very old school. I think that I spend 80% of my time in Excel. Actually, I do a lot of my analysis in Excel, and sometimes I will go to a if I have a large quantity of data, I might go to a SQL database like Postgres or MySQL or something like that. I'm not very good with R. I do some programming in Python, but mostly to sort of pull data out of a website or pull data together from for instance, for the election this year, the election agency in Sweden published for each local council, they published one JSON file, and we wanted to pull all that together so that we could do analysis over all the local councils and all the constituencies around the area that my papers cover. So then I used Python to sort of drag out that data and compile it together and do the analysis that way. I hear a lot of good things about R. It's just that I haven't gone around to learning that yet. And I actually think that there's a lot of data analysis you could do in Excel. And one thing that I really like about Excel, I'm just going to say also, is that because I'm always looking for a story. I'm looking for the story. So I want to sort of see my data. And I think sometimes it is harder to see your data. I actually want to look at the rows and look at the columns and see what happens. And by that, seeing my data. But I hear a lot of good things about R. I think it's a great tool. It's just that I haven't gone around to using it yet.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps there is another question from Wesley, but I know perhaps you are not so familiar with a radio broadcast. I'm not so sure, but his question is, how can one simply data and make it, I think, how can one simply show data and make it interesting in radio broadcast? I think that will be challenging, but perhaps we can have some tips from Helena and Amanda. Amanda first and then Helena.
Yeah, I think, if you are using the data to find the story, then I think the stories can happen in radio super easily. I do think there are some of the tips that I was talking about in visualization also translate to radio, in the sense of can I describe a walk on the moon as a walk to across the soccer field, right? That works in English too. That sort of the prose of that works just as well. I do think there are things that are harder, and this is not limited to radio. It's also I think, there's been some focus on data visualization about how do we make things more accessible to maybe people who don't have access to sight or other things. So screen reader capabilities. And you can describe a line chart. You can describe the shape of it. It rises for some, I think it's not quite as good as seeing it, but that's, there are trade-offs where things are more powerful too.
Thank you. Helena?
Well, I remember an example from a organization called Center for Investigative Reporting, I think, Reveal in California, where they looked at earthquakes and the frequency on how that there were much more earthquakes now than there was and then previously. So I remember an amazing sound illustration that somebody did about that, where they sort of did a beep on sort of every time they said, we're going to compress 10 years, or it was 25 years into 1 minute, and we're going to make a beep every time an earthquake happened in our area at, and sort of compress that 10 years into 1 minute. And it was really, really powerful the way that they sort of did that sound wise. And they did quite a lot of tries in doing data visualizations on radio. I think it's hard. I think you have to describe it, you have to think about it, but some of the sort of, when you look at frequency and things like that, it is impossible to do this as a radio, but it is harder. It's also harder with broadcasters in general. I've spent a lot of time in television, and it is so much easier when it comes to visualizations when somebody can sort of look at your thing and decide for how long you're looking at it, instead of just giving it a blip on television as we usually do.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena. We have more questions. Perhaps we can now start with you, Helena. The question says, what are some of the best techniques of collating data at grassroots level? For example, prevalence of female genital mutilation, child pregnancies, etc.
I actually didn't get to that, which was a little bit sad. I had an example of sort of how do you do if you want to collect your data. I think that you can do that. You also only have to be wary about the fact that it will not be a scientific sort of selection in that matter that you, but we have done, for instance, we have done several of stories like that, where we, for instance, interviewed small business owners in areas where there were a lot of crime, and to sort of get a story on how were they affected by this area these areas that we were looking for. And what we did then was that we asked the reporters to went out. We had reporters all over Sweden, and they went out and interviewed 100 small business owners. And then they asked them all the same questions. So in that manner, and then we forced the reporters to actually record those answers into a form that turned into a database so that we could talk about. And of course, that wasn't scientific. We didn't talk to every small business owner, and we had no comparison with small business owners outside of these areas and so on. So there's a lot of flaws in that method, but as long as we talk about what we did. I've also had some success, actually. We did a huge project on sexual harassment in universities at The Guardian when I was there. And for that, we had a survey attached to any story we did that was in that area, to collect sort of examples from people writing to us and telling their story. And the same thing there, we can't use that data to say so-and-so % of female students, but we can use it as examples, and we could also use it actually as collateral when we were talking to the universities, trying to get them to talk about how many reports they had done and how many cases they had. And we could say that we already know of cases in your university because we have people witnessing about that. So I think that when collecting data that doesn't exist, sort of, you have to be careful, but it's possible. You just have to be very careful in describing how you do it. That's my sort of take on that.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, perhaps you would like to add something on this?
I think I would co-sign just the being honest with yourself and your readers about what's missing, but which is not to say that you shouldn't do it. Like, it's great, right? All of a sudden you have an exclusive because you have something. You can think of it as, even if it's like there are huge holes and there's like your structure is not great, like it's going to be more structure than if you just approach the story through anecdotes, right? So like, no matter what, even if it's not perfect, like we don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. You know, I think of things about like, sometimes like what some of the like disaster response graphics about, like, let me like tell you about like every business on a block where something really bad happened, or in some of them are missing, like Helena said. That's okay. Like, it says like I tried. And so just being honest with yourself about like, you're not gonna, who talked to you, what do you learn about who talked to you, why might there be some biases in that, but that's okay. Like, there's gonna be biases in who talked to you from any type of story. So just honesty about that.
Thank you. Perhaps just a final question, since we don't have any more, but I would like you to ask what will be some themes for cross-border tips for cross-border teams that collaborate and would like to start their journey on data journalism. You know that sometimes data differs from country to country, and how you can advise journalists to proceed on data journalism when you have different kind of sources, different types of databases as well. What will be the best recommendation for them, especially because at Journalism Fund we give grants to this kind of cross-border teams. So perhaps Amanda, you would like to start?
Yeah, I wonder sometimes if you can turn that into a strength as opposed to a weakness as you try to figure out what is true in the commonalities. Like, I think of sometimes about like how trade data, like, you know, different countries collect their own types and it should match up and it doesn't. And like, maybe there's something to learn from the discrepancies about, like, you know, the US says like, oh, I imported this much from China, and China says like, oh, I shipped this much to the US, and they don't match. And like, so like, you can let the don't match be frustrating and say like, oh, there's nothing to learn here. Or you can let, maybe there's a good story idea in there somewhere. And so I think some of the cross-border stuff, like, can be frustrating that it's like, oh, it's not true, but it's a good reminder for all of us. Like all of it is a proxy for something, and how we measure things is important. And there's not any like all of this is a proxy for truth. So the cross-border thing is a strength that it reveals that like we have different proxies, and none of those proxies are the actual truth. Of not let it be such of a blocker about like, oh, everything's impossible. Maybe they both show the same general pattern, even if they don't show the exact same like quadrillion BTUs or micrograms per cubic meter or whatever the answer is.
Thank you, Amanda. Helena?
I must agree with Amanda saying that you could use your weaknesses into strengths, sort of, because very often you can see, for instance, take such a simple thing as unemployment rate. I think that in certain countries you measure them from 16 years and upwards, and in other countries you measure them from 18 years and upwards. In other countries you measure them from 20 years and upwards. And that of course gets super frustrated if you want to bang everything together, but always, I mean, looking at such a diagram side by side can give you, you know, a story in itself, a story about that people work in much earlier years in, for instance, maybe some countries than they do in other countries. So I think that, and also it goes back to what I talked about previously, which is sort of, and I loved Amanda saying that perfect is not the enemy of good, or whatever you said. I mean, we sometimes we get so stuck in sort of, it has to be exactly the same, but as long as we talk about to our audience, as long as we talk about to our readers, what have we done? What have we collected? What are we showing here? Why is it different? Why is it different from this country to this country? Then I think it could be, as you said, it could be used as a strength instead of a weakness. And then, of course, also look for, I think that another way is that look for these organizations that are international, like Eurostat or the World Bank, or maybe trade organizations that go, because they usually have had the same problems, and they might have, you know, an intelligent way of solving it. So there could have been people that have gone before you that have solved that problem. So look maybe for experts in that field.
Thank you. Thank you both, Helena and Amanda, for today's session. Your presentations were great. To be honest, it's my first time diving into data journalism. I'm a journalist myself, but it looks very interesting and I would like to try it out. So thank you. Thank you for your interventions today. Well, that's all we got for you here today. And thank you for joining our attendees to discuss about data journalism and visualization. Also, we would like to let you know that we prepare a survey about the webinars. It's on the chat, and you can go to the form and to fill it in. Also, we would like to remind you about our Earth Investigations program. The next deadline for investigations grants for environmental journalism is on 12 January 2023, and for the professional development grants for environmental journalism is on 9 February 2023. So both deadlines are next year, and if you have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to contact us to have meetings for pre-application advice. I would also like to say that Amanda and Helena, they are part of our list of mentors. So if you see that you need some help or some assistance in your project with the data journalism, they can be your mentors. So please don't hesitate to choose them as mentors. They do a great job in their field. So you know now that you can count on them if you need some help from these mentors. And feel free to reach us out via email if you have any further questions, and of course subscribe to our newsletter, because there is where we'll be informing about our next events. So having said this, we'll see you next time. Thank you, Helena and Amanda, again for your great interventions, and thank you our attendees for participating. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye.